And we're back for part 5 of my 2022 Over the Board recap series. Now, after licking my wounds after a really awful Cherry Blossom tournament at the end of May, I was actually not really planning to play another tournament until the big one in July, which is the World Open. But seeing as how the last tournament went so poorly, I decided I needed to redeem myself. And so I signed up for this 5-round kind of small tournament CCA event in Stamford, Connecticut, about 2-hour drive away from me, about 2 weeks later. And I actually took a bye for the first round on Friday evening, so I came in Saturday morning on half a point, and now I am playing a 13-year-old kid rated just under 2,000. I opened with e4. He goes c5, and I had seen a little bit of his game history online, and it looked like he played some kind of like a Kalashnikov, but that was from a few years ago, so it wasn't really reliable. It turns out he plays the Najdorf, which a lot of kids do. No surprise there. Go h3, and he plays this kind of interesting line with this early b5. Usually people will play bishop e6, bishop e7, h5 if they want to really clamp down, but b5 he plays. I was like, okay, interesting. I go g4 anyway. And he goes bishop b7. He could play b4 and actually win this pawn. But I figured that I would have some compensation here on the long diagonal because he always has to watch out for some tricks with the knight moves. And actually the engine says that this is like really bad for black. That after f5, bishop e3, that black is like already borderline busted. So he didn't go for that though. He just played bishop b7 and played bishop g2. And now he decided to play b4. And basically, we get this trade after I throw the knight into d5. And he goes knight d7. And this is the first one where I kind of stopped to think. Castling would be very natural, but I did not want to allow him to play h5 and get some counterplay, against my kind of overextended pawn on g4. So I decided to play knight g3 first to cover. And he should have, at this point, probably played like bishop e7. We both castled. This is kind of what I was expecting to happen. Pretty standard kind of Adams attack Najdorf position here. But he played rook c8. So I was like, okay, so he is neglecting his kingside development. He wants to do something on the queen side. He wants to pressure down the c file. So if I castle, then he goes queen c7. The c2 pawn is hit. Looks a little bit unpleasant, I thought. Now, it turns out after bishop d2, if he takes now, I can just take on b4, and the fact that he's kind of, going pawn grabbing is not really going to be too good for him. But I decided to play bishop d2 first, attack his pawn, so that if he plays queen c7, now I basically take. And I was calculating this line where I play bishop c3 back and then try to trap his rook. I didn't really see how exactly I was going to do that. Turns out that I actually can. I just would have had to find the move rook f1. Which is a pretty nice move. Not castling, because then I don't really have a way to attack his rook, but actually rook f1, and then using my king to attack his rook. And he actually needs to basically give it up, and then I'm up the exchange. But it didn't come to that because he played the move a5, solidifying his pawn. But when he did this, I'm like, all right, he's kind of, again, overextending on the queen side. I'm going to push back against him. And I play a3. He takes some time and he goes queen c7, which I already thought that he needed to do something like play b3 and just give the pawn up and try to go for some counterplay, maybe stop me from castling. But then I played bishop f1 and I should be fine. He plays queen c7. I take, he takes, and this was actually after I took the pawn as well. He took my pawn. This was a real critical moment because I'm thinking, all right, do I trade queens with him? Or do I castle and kind of see if he wants to trade queens on my terms? What do I do? And eventually I decided to castle and basically leave the b2 pawn hanging. And I calculated a lot of very interesting lines. And I will show you some of them. So first of all, if he takes, the move that I was looking at very intently was the move queen a4. Basically pressuring the knight, pinning him, and also he has to be careful not to get his queen tangled up. If he plays something like g6, some slow move, I'm already jumping into knight e4. The d6 pawn is weak. He's in big trouble. If he plays rook a8, my first instinct was I'm going to sack the queen, and he has to play king e7, basically. I can throw him this check. I can take this pawn. And this is just a wild position where, he has the queen, but I have a rook and a minor piece in return, and his king is in the middle of nowhere. If he plays g6, I actually didn't see this in the game, but I would have this filthy move now, rook takes f8, where if he takes back with the rook, I have checkmate. So, it turns out that he could play h5 here, and that's like the only move that keeps him afloat, but practically looks really bad for black. Actually, I then realized that, I don't even have to sack the queen. I have queen b5 even, where I let him take the rook, and then I take the bishop, and again, I'm down material, but his back rank is so vulnerable. If he takes the rook here, how does he defend his back rank? Like, he's just not in time to castle. I can immediately start attacking him. I can take this pawn. He can't castle. Again, his position is just in real bad shape. So he decided not to go for any of that stuff. I mean, the best he could have done at this point, which I should mention, his position is like hanging by a thread, would have been to take the queen. But this looks really bad again because his pieces are not very well developed. My knight is coming into the game. Something like this could have happened where I can bring this rook in and then maybe maneuver my bishop to attack, give this check. And yeah, this position would be really tough to defend. I mean, it's not that easy for me to break through either. Like, I was analyzing this position a lot after the game, and it wasn't easy to find the way through, but eventually white kind of busts open. Black is just so behind on development. So he decides after a while, he doesn't take the queen, he doesn't take the pawn, he plays knight to b6, which is just way too slow. And he spent a long time doing it too. He had 45 minutes, and he went down to like less than 20. Plays knight b6, I play knight f5, I'm going for your weak d pawn. He backtracks to defend it, and now he's dead, because he's so behind in development. I come in with the rook, queen goes to b8, and what should I play next here? First, my instinct was maybe I should sack the exchange, then take on d6 and prevent him from castling. But then he plays knight d7, and even though he still can't castle because of my bishop, he can maybe play f6, king f7, and it's not so easy for me to make progress. So instead, I played the very nice move queen to a1, defending the rook and also preparing to kind of infiltrate on the a file. And here's the first kind of puzzle for you. What happens if he plays g6? What should I play in this position? There's actually a move here which I did not fully see in the game. See if you can find it. So again, my instinct in the game was I sack the exchange, then take here, and then stop him from castling. But again, he plays knight to d7, and he kind of hangs on. So then I thought, what if I take on d6 twice? He takes the queen, then I take this bishop, and then I win a pawn. But again, he castles, and he kind of gets out of danger, even though I'm still better. But it's not that easy. Turns out what I missed was after bishop takes d6. This does work, but you have to throw in the move rook takes b7 now. And if he takes the rook, I should mention, then I take the bishop. It's a fork, and he loses the queen. Yeah, he's basically busted. So he has to take the knight. I would take the queen. And this position is still not, like, strictly speaking over, because he does have a rook and a knight in exchange for a queen, but his king is not going to be really too safe even once he castles. And yeah, this position shouldn't be too difficult to convert. In the game, though, he played bishop to a8. Another very sad move. I guess he kind of sensed that I would have some rook takes b7 tricks, so he backed out. But again, I'm just allowed to further infiltrate. I play queen a6. And now the queen is trying to get to b5, and his king is just super exposed. He plays g6, and I go check. I'm like, that's it. It's game over. Because if he plays king to d8, I can actually play bishop a5, and if he takes my rook, I take his knight, fork. That's it. And then he plays bishop c6. And I had forgotten that I'd actually seen this move, but I forgot that when I take, he takes my rook. So I actually just lost the exchange. So I had to kind of stop and compose myself for a minute because after my last tournament, I made a lot of blunders and suddenly I just missed something here. I got to make sure that I still have things under control. Luckily, I do, though, because even though I'm down the exchange, all my pieces are active and he has zero counterplay. So all I have to do now is figure out how to finish this game off. What do you think I should play here? So it turns out the most straightforward thing you can do is actually the best, and there's two moves which are both pretty much equally winning. You can take on d6 with either piece. I spent a few minutes and decided to take with the bishop. Taking with the knight is also good. Only thing is I didn't really see what to do here. Like I saw I could give this check, and then he sidesteps the king, and I can give another check, and he kind of gets away. Like obviously this is winning. I can infiltrate with the queen, but or I could play bishop c5 and pin the knight. But I thought that taking with the bishop would actually be cleaner, because if he takes back, I take with the knight, and now I'm also threatening to pick up the pawn. If he goes king to d8, I'm actually mating him, pretty much. Or, I mean, he can go to e7, and then I take this and then take the rook. So only real move he could have played would be king f8. Then again, I would pick up the pawn. Rook's under attack. Again, notice how I'm down the exchange technically. Well, I mean, I have two pawns and a bishop for a rook now, so I'm hardly down material. But on top of that, no coordination between his pieces. His rooks aren't connected, so he has to play rook g8. I can pick up this rook, and then even just play c7, and eventually, I infiltrate, and I'm going to win his rook. It's going to be game over. But actually, after bishop takes d6 here, after I took this pawn, he thought for a minute or two. He had like 12 minutes left. He thought for a minute, and then he asks me, can I go to the bathroom, or should I make my move first? And, usually tournament etiquette it's a little bit suspicious if you get up when it's your move. So I'm like, just make your move, and then you can go. And this kid says, okay. And then he proceeds to just sit there until his time runs out. Doesn't make a move, and doesn't go to the bathroom. Just waits until his time runs out, and then he actually acts surprised when he flags. And I pointed out to him, and he's like, what? I'm like, dude, your time ran out. It's game over. So, yeah, that was kind of a weird end, a little bit anticlimactic, that nothing played out from this position. Game only lasted 24 moves, but it was a pretty emphatic victory on the road back to redemption. And so I'm on 1.5 out of 2 now, which means I'm going to have a pretty strong opponent in the third round. And a strong opponent I indeed got. This guy is a national master, rated in the mid-2300s. I'd actually played him at the same tournament back in November, and I'd managed to get a draw, although he showed up like 30 minutes late to a 60-minute game, so he had like half the time to work with, and he made a mistake in the middle game. I managed to draw actually from a better position. He basically forced a perpetual. But this game is obviously going to be different. It's a full time control game, and I'm not going to focus too much on the opening and middle game because it was a very long game. I played my usual stuff. He played this line with this early a5, basically try to cramp me on the queen side. I don't mind it too much because I can kind of rebel. But he really tried to clamp down. He played b4. I drove his bishop back, and it was kind of slightly worse most of the time. But things got interesting around here. So he forced this kind of trade where he gets the d5 square. And here is where I made a slight mistake. I played the move knight to b6, attacking his bishop, thinking that if he takes on b5, I can take because I'm attacking his queen, or I can play bishop d7. Turns out, though, he actually could have taken the pawn, because if I take the bishop, what I missed is that he can take the rook. And after bishop d7, I think maybe in the game I thought that I'd trap his queen here, but he has this move rook a7, where if I take his queen, he takes mine. And yeah, I can't really do much here. So my other move would be bishop to d7, but now he can actually take the knight and play queen a5, and he basically just comes out with an extra pawn. Not looking too good for me. But he missed that. He went back with the bishop, And this allowed me to throw the knight to c4, and we end up trading queens into this endgame where still, maybe I'm slightly worse, maybe it's about equal. I thought that I have good chances now. I play d5, trying to liquidate my weak d6 pawn. We trade. The only problem is my pawn on c4 is kind of weak. Like, I have to really defend it. And he's obviously trying to put pressure, but we're both getting pretty low on the clock at this point. Like, we both each have maybe 10 minutes or so. I decide to trade bishops. He plays f3. I try to play f5. Maybe a little bit risky move, but I didn't want to let him put his knight on e4. And I'm just going back. Kind of clever way to defend the pawn because he can't take because his knight's hanging, so he goes back. I come in to defend the pawn. And here I thought that he should play rook e7, and I was calculating this sequence where I win the pawn in I can win the pawn in c3, but then he takes on f5, and this pawn's falling. I could play g6, but then he comes back, and it looked like I might be in a little bit of trouble, but he decided instead to play knight e3. And eventually I managed to infiltrate with the rook, and he kind of played a little too passively. I thought that maybe he can even sack the exchange and go for something like this. It's a little bit unclear, though, so he decided to defend the pawn. And eventually, I managed to orchestrate a sort of a breakthrough. I played e4, letting him take on c4, but we end up trading here, and I take the knight, and I get in with the rook. And now I'm happy because I'm temporarily down a pawn, but he has no way to really save his f3 pawn, and I have a lot of activity. So he plays b5, letting me take, and I go check. And basically, like, I realize I have a draw in my pocket because if I just keep checking him, what does he do to get out? Like, if he had gone with his king here, I would have just kept checking, and if he goes to h-file, I can take h3 pawn with check. He goes back, though. And I considered taking, but it looked a bit dangerous because, I have to watch out for the b-pawn. So I decided to check again and basically bait him into, doing something. Because he obviously wants to play for the win, so he doesn't want to settle for repetition. And I take the pawn in c3. If he takes, then I can actually pick off this pawn and come back in time by going to h7 and then to b7. So he takes here and goes rook to b2. But I'm like, wait a minute, can I take on h3? Because I'm in time to win his rook, aren't I? And then, of course, I realize that if I go for this, he gets his king to c3 in time, and I'm actually losing here. Because if I trade rooks, I have 3 pawns, but his is queens first. And if I go back, then I have to give up the rook, basically, and this should be losing for me because my pawns aren't far enough up the board. So I have to adjust and play rook e3 check and drop back with the rook and put my rook in front of this pawn. And we have this absolutely bizarre endgame where I am up 2 pawns. I have 3, basically, 2.5 pass pawns, right? Because I have a set of double pawns. But I'm up 2 pawns and he can't queen. But because my rook is stuck, it's also very hard for me to make progress. He puts his king on f3, I put my king on g7. And somewhere around this point, I offered him a draw because I'm like, neither of us can really make progress. But he obviously says no because he wants to still try to win, somehow finesse me. Like, he goes rook b1. If I am stupid enough to play king h5, then this is actually mate. And so I decide to play g4, give my king some room. But he puts his king on f4, and it's hard for me to make progress now. What I should have done at this point is basically just sat back. Just play king g7. Because he can never really get in. Like, I can just sit with the king. If he ever tries to go for the pawn, first of all, I can maybe start pushing the g-pawn now, or I can even start moving my king this way. And he can't really win the pawns while protecting his own. Instead, I did something kind of dumb here, and I decided to play g3, basically throwing away one of the pawns because I thought, oh, okay, I get my king to g5 now. But then he plays rook b6, and I'm like, wait a minute, what do I even do? I can't make any progress. If I go king h5, then he plays king f4. I have to be careful not to get my king cut. So I go king h6, he goes king f4. And again, he plays this rook b1 move where it's like he's threatening mate. So I have to go back. He plays king e5. And I start to realize at this point that he is trying to get me to put my king in a bad position and then quickly run his king, force me to give up my rook for his pawn, and then get his king back and his rook back in time to stop me and basically try to still win the game. So I'm like, okay, but that's not going to happen because I still have 2 pawns. Then he goes check. He brings his king back, forcing me to go to h6. Brings his rook back. Like, he's just kind of shuffling around, trying to get me to do something, make some kind of mistake. And now he plays king e5. And this is really the critical moment of the game. Although I did not realize it at the time, how careful I have to be here. Because when you're in an endgame situation like this, it's not like when you're in the middle game and, you can kind of go off intuition, kind of like calculate a little bit and guess sort of along the way. There's no guesswork here. You have to calculate to the end. What do you think that I should play here? What should black play to not lose the game? Now, what I thought was that if I play king f7, trying to bring my king this way, well, I'm just going to be too slow. He's going to bring his king in, and this looks really bad. He queens, and then I'm losing, right? Wrong. Actually, in this case, I can make a draw because his king and rook are too far. And basically, by the time his king comes back, I get down the board, and here I have to just go for one little trick, make a knight, because that forces his king to move away, and he can't really do anything. Even simpler thing I can do, though, is I could have just played g5. Basically got a head start moving the pawns up the board. And if he goes king d6, well, now I have a head start on pushing my pawns up. And it's going to take him a long time. He can win the rook, but I have 2 connected passed pawns, and I can shoulder his king out of the way and shouldn't have any problems making a draw. If he takes on f5, I can just bring my king over and eventually win the b7 pawn because I get my king there first. Instead, I play the horrific move king to h6. And this move actually loses the game, believe it or not, because now he plays king to d6. I go king to g5. But the problem is that now when I take, his king is just close enough that he can actually get it to e5, and I can't hold on to all my pawns. Like, if I had played f4 here, he can actually just play king f5 and then give me a check and then just take my pawn. That's it. I'm stopped. So I play g4, and I'm like in denial at this point. I'm like, there's no shot I'm losing this. But he goes check and plays king f4. And that's it. It's a wrap. If he had at least taken, I would have still had a chance because I could promote to a knight. But even this might be... No, this is actually a draw. And I was hoping that he would do this. But nope, he's smart enough to play king f4, stopping my furthest advanced pawn from getting through. And yeah, it's game over. Heartbreaking loss because I did so well to hang in there with a much stronger player. Got to a drawn endgame, which, if anything, like I should have been the one with better chances to win. But I just got basically finessed, I guess you can say, and did not calculate at the critical moment and ended up giving away the game. So the following morning, I played another kid, rated again, like right around 2000. I was black, and I managed to win a pretty smooth game. It was 60 moves long, but I was basically winning from like move 20. I already pretty much had a decisive advantage. It just took a while to convert. So I'm not going to focus on that game. I'm going to focus all my remaining energy on this next game, which is what you came here to see. This is the final round of the tournament. Going in, I had 2.5 points out of 4, which I already basically tied my score from this tournament last year, and I was looking to surpass it. I'm up against a 2350 rated master from New York, just 13 years old, but he is the top or number 3 ranked player of his age group in the country, very strong player. And I'd actually played him once before, back in September of 2021. Lost that game with black. He just outplayed me in like a very complicated early end game. So I knew obviously this kid is strong, but I also knew what opening he plays, and that is the Sicilian con variation with a6. And I had prepared for his hedgehog. And here, there's a line which I like to play where I go bishop to d2 and f4. And there's a line I like to play where I go f4 and then king h1 and then bishop to d2 and try to basically pressure black down the center. In this game, for some reason, I started with bishop d2. And after f4, he played the move rook to d8, which was a surprise to me. It's kind of an awkward looking move. Like, it's not really clear what the rook is doing on d8. But I said, okay, king h1. He goes b6, again looking for this kind of hedgehog setup where black is very solid but doesn't have much space. I bring my rook to the center. He goes bishop back to f8. And now I play the move knight back to f3. Kind of a weird looking move if you've never seen it, but the point is that I want to play e5. But if I rush, he can actually take and then take on e5 with the knight, because at the end of the line, the knight on d4 hangs. So knight f3 is aimed at both getting it out of danger and also further preparing e5. He goes g6. I spend 8 minutes here, and I'm like, go time, e5. I'm attacking his knight. He can take and then get his knight out of the way. This was probably the best he could have done. Or played knight h5 here, but he played the move knight to g4. And this is where things get really crazy. According to the computer, my advantage at this point is like +2.5 or +3, like very significant. And I could feel in the game like I had something, but to actually find a concrete continuation is very difficult. Like, I spent 20 minutes in this position, and the best I could come up with was knight e4. Basically saying that if you try to win a pawn, well, I am going to get this check in. Actually, I can win a piece here, because I can go bishop c3, and, I mean, his knight has to move, and I have all kind of discoveries lined up, so he can't really do that. If he plays queen takes, then I have knight f6 check, and again, I can actually win a piece. However, he then just played bishop b7. Now, if we back up a little bit, I should say that in this position, I put this on my board, and I was using it as some sort of calculation training, and like, I was banging my head against the wall trying to figure out what the best thing to do for white here is. It turns out it actually is a move which I considered, that's knight to g5. But then I saw that he can go back with knight h6, and I didn't really see what to do next. And you can pause if you want and try to figure out what white should do. It's a very complicated position. I have sort of what's called a dynamic advantage at this point, as opposed to a static advantage, which is when a static advantage basically means that your position is just better, and you can just make kind of whatever moves as long as they're reasonable, you're going to still keep your advantage. A dynamic advantage, though, is when you have a position where if you don't capitalize on what you have, it's going to be gone in the span of a few moves. And that's kind of how it is here. If I don't act now, you know, I might still be a little bit better, but it's not going to be anything special to work with. And so in this position, there's a couple of tempting options. I mean, I could take on d6, and if he takes the bishop, actually, there's this knight takes e6 sacrifice that I was calculating for a long time, where the knight comes into d5, and then I can even sack on g6, and things get really crazy. Black's kingside just gets blown open, and even though I'm down 2 pieces here, I'm actually winning. There's a lot of other crazy lines, which I'm not going to delve too much into. But it turns out the best move in this position, move which, okay, I can't blame myself for not seeing this, because this is a hard move to see. Knight to d5. Kind of a thematic Sicilian move. Oftentimes you see a knight sacrifice. But here it's like weird, because usually it's to clear the f5 square. Like, usually the pawn on e6 will be defending f5 from a knight. Here the point, though, is that if black takes, you just rush the pawn down the middle. And if they take, then king just gets blown open. There's like this check coming. There's knight f7 check. It's looking pretty bad for black. If they move the knight, then you actually play f5. And it's just a crazy position, because like black can take, but then the bishop is starting to come in, and it's very hard to assess, but white has a lot of pressure aimed at the king side. Not to mention the fact that black doesn't even have to take the knight. They can move the queen out of the way. But here's where you really got to grab the initiative by the balls and play f5. And again, like, this position is insane. Like, black now, if they don't take, then they can take on e5, and the knights start to come in. Looks pretty bad for black. So what I was looking at is takes on d5, and then pawn takes here, knight takes, e6, take the knight, take on g6. And even this position, like, if you look at it for a minute, you're like, okay, white is down a piece for a pawn. Yes, black's king is open, but, like, is it really winning? Turns out it is, because you bring the queen in, you're threatening, actually, what you're threatening is pretty cool, because if, let's say, black just takes his pawn, you have this sick move, rook f7, basically cutting the queen off from defending the 7th rank. If knight takes, there's mate. So black has to basically take the bishop, and then they block with the queen. And again, I was looking at this position, I was like, isn't this just a dead end because they block? But no, you go back, threatening the pawn on d5, and when black defends it, you play rook f4, and rook g4 is coming to pin the queen. That's it. Black is done. Just crazy. Like, this kind of thing, I'm going to have to work on my calculation a lot to be able to pull this off in a game. But anyway, back to the game continuation. I did not play knight g5 because I didn't see how to proceed. I played knight e4. And I also saw, like, maybe knight c5 he can play, maybe trade of knights, and then I kick his knight back, and I thought this is decent for me. He goes bishop b7, and again, I have chances here. And I tanked for a long time. I did not find the best way forward. What I should have done is taken on d6, and then played knight to g5. Basically with the same ideas where I'm trying to, like, I'm looking for some sacrifices to break his kingside open, but also I can simply trade here and play bishop c3. And this is a very nice setup because I have the bishop pair. My dark square bishop is a monster dominating this diagonal, and he has to be super careful here. Instead, I played bishop to c3 without trading, but this allowed him to play d5. And now he's starting to kind of get back into the game. Like, even though I'm still a bit better, his bishop is now active. My bishop, yeah, it's okay on c3, but it doesn't have an open diagonal. And here is where, I was already starting to get low on time. I'm under half an hour, and it's not even move 20. And before this move, I'd been trying to, like, be careful, play precise moves. And of course, the second I rush, I make a bad move. I play knight to g5. Correct idea, wrong knight. I should have put the other knight on g5. And the difference is that when I put this knight, I give up control of c5. He plays knight c5. I'm not even better anymore. I'm actually worse because I have to move the bishop. And now he starts to launch a queenside initiative where he's threatening bishop c4 to pin my queen and my rook, or skewer, I should say. So I have to backtrack. And here the game gets wild. I mean, we're both kind of low on time considering that we have 20 more minutes until we get bonus time. So we're just maneuvering around. I'm trying to, like, dodge his threats. He was threatening b4. So I go a3. He gets his knight to f5. He gets his rook to c8. He plays h5 so that I can't really get his knight off of f5. And now I played bishop b4, trying to trade off his dark square bishop because I figured that's going to really weaken him on the dark squares. Like d6, f6 could be targets. He decided not to trade. I play knight to g5, and here is where he found a really nice maneuver. So he plays knight to d4. I take, and then he takes the rook on c1. So I have to take. He takes on d4. And I realize that my f4 pawn is hanging, right? Because he basically forced my rook away from the defense. And he's also threatening to take the knight and then destabilize the pawn on e5, and my whole center collapses. And if I go knight h3, if I go back with rook f1, actually, yeah, he just takes and then takes here. And this is really bad. So I played knight h3, but I had no defense against him taking here. Like, there was nothing I can do, really. I thought maybe I play rook f1 and try to get some kind of counterplay, because I can take here, but then he takes my knight, and I'm down 2 pawns. Not looking too good. There were some other lines I was calculating too, but he actually surprised me. He did not take. There was something he saw which looked risky to him. Maybe he didn't like. He thought I can just do this and hold the pawn on e5, and he didn't want to allow me the bishop pair. He plays knight to b8, which is like, I'm granted a whole new life because I could have been in really bad shape there. Now I'm able to kind of consolidate, kick his rook back, kick his queen back. And we're both getting down on time. I have to watch out for pressure on the diagonal. Both of us are down in just a few minutes. He plays knight to d7. And, I still have like 5 moves until we get an additional 30 minutes. But I spot a very interesting move here as my time is running down. And I'm like, I have to play this. f5. Surprise. And this move really caught him off guard. The point is that I'm threatening his bishop, but I'm also threatening to take on g6 and, again, kind of bust up his kingside. If he takes, I would actually just take here, and if he tries to bring the bishop back, his whole kingside gets blown open, and his king is not going to escape. I mean, he's just getting mated. What he could have done, though, is actually taken, and I thought, again, this looks pretty good for me because if he moves the rook, I take the bishop. Turns out, though, that this position is actually equal, even though his king side is very open, but he also has some pressure, some counterplay. He got like really shook, though, and he decided to give up the piece. He took on f5, and I took his bishop, and he took on e5. So he basically gets 2 pawns back for the piece, but, I should just be much better, right? I play bishop f4. He goes f6. I have just a few minutes left, and there's still 1 or 2 moves until time control. And here I made a very questionable decision. I should have just played bishop back to b1. But I was kind of scared of ghost. I was scared of some kind of tricks on the file, even though his knight is literally pinned. He doesn't have any tricks. But I took the knight, which just helps him because it undoubles his pawns. And now he has a passed e-pawn. And finally we make time control, and I play queen to d2. And then he plays rook to d8. And even though I have 30 minutes added to my clock, I'm sitting there and I'm like, I'm up a piece, but how do I make progress here? And how do I actually not fall for his tricks? Because if I play h4, which I wanted to play at first to solidify the knight, he has this move. And my bishop is pinned to my queen. If I take, he takes. And I can bring my queen in, but, I can take this. He blocks. He has a passed... he has 2 pass pawns, basically, looking pretty dangerous for me. If I go bishop back to e2, I almost played this move. I would have blundered the game on the spot. So eventually I'm like, all right, let's go back with bishop b1. Watching for the sacrifice. But he goes bishop c4, and it's so difficult for me to see how to make progress. Like, I move the queen back. Even though he is down material, he is actually, like, it feels like he's the one in control. And he offers a queen trade, and I'm scared to trade queens because he has a lot of dangerous pawns. But eventually, he forces a trade of queens because I go to a5, he goes to d2, forking my queen and rook. So I have to trade queens, and I'm scared at this point. I'm like, imagine if I did all that, won a piece just to lose the game in this tricky endgame. If I play b4, he goes e4, and I'm just getting run over. So I go back with the knight, forking the rook and the pawn. He goes to d5. And I try to, pressure him, but he infiltrates the second rank. I have to move the pawn. He starts to bring his king in. He puts the rook on b2. He's threatening to, try to get this pawn. And eventually I was like, all right, I cannot just sit back passively. I have to do something. And so I sack the bishop for 2 pawns to get rid of his kind of pawns, which are keeping me kind of imprisoned. And now at least I have some activity. If he brings his king forward, I even have this fork, and I can basically bail out to a draw because everything gets traded. He goes king g7, though. And now I go knight c5, attacking his pawn. But he goes bishop d5. And, if I take, then he takes on g2. So I have to defend. Or actually, I threw in this check and got to f4. And I'm just barely holding on. I'm defending everything. he decides to go g5. One line I was a little bit scared of was that if he trades the rooks here, because I'm like, he's going to start to bring his king towards my pawn. And I was scared of that. After the game, he told me that he didn't like this because he saw that I can just maneuver my knight to c5 and force his bishop to defend his pawns. And he's like, you know, why would I go for this? I'm worse. I didn't even realize during the game. It shows how much better he is in endgames than me. He goes g5, though, and forces this trade. But I can tell at this point, like, I should be able to hold on here. You know, I just need to sit tight. He's going to try some tricks, try to, you know, get some checks in, but I actually got a check in of my own and eventually started to check him. And after a couple of checks, we basically repeated the position 3 times, and he settled for a draw. And, you know, if he goes back with the king, then actually I can take on a6, and now I'm actually better. But if I take here, the difference is that he has bishop to d1 check, and I think he gets his king active. Well, why was I actually scared of this? I don't even exactly remember. Yeah, I think something like this, and then, you know, king comes here. But anyway, I was more than content with a draw after that scary endgame, which I was scared I was going to lose. Yeah, very crazy game. You know, I had a pretty significant advantage out of the opening, but those positions where you have such an advantage are very hard to play. You know, I'm going to have to really work on my calculation to try to push those to victories in the future. But yeah, I mean, I finished the tournament with 3 out of 5, which is a pretty solid result. I mean, technically the games I played, I finished with 2.5 out of 4 plus a half-point bye. It was enough for a bit of a rating gain. I got up to 20 points back from what I lost, still under 2,100, but making progress in the right direction. And the fact that I had such close games against 223-50 rated players, even though, you know, I only scored half out of 2 in those games, was definitely a big confidence boost heading into real big tournament, the World Open, which you can catch in the next recap. Stay tuned.